What it really takes is a family, and we as conservatives have to fight for the family.
A party that desires to lead this country must have an agenda that the American people believe helps them.
What is it that we can do to keep government from growing so large we can win this battle?
All right, we will get started on our last panel for this afternoon, Empire and Economy, Great Powers in Conflict. And we have an illustrious group of panelists and foreign policy experts joining us today. On the far end, we have Will Ruger. He is the president of the American Institute for Economic Research. He was also nominated by President Trump to serve as the ambassador for Afghanistan, and he is also on the board of the Fulbright Scholarship. He was previously an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Texas State University and an adjunct assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. Next, we have Michael Anton. He is a lecturer in politics and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center. He previously served as the former deputy assistant to President Trump for strategic communications. He also served in the Bush White House, as well as in the administrations of California Governor Pete Wilson and New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. He has extensive experience in the private sector. He was educated at the Claremont Graduate University, St. John's College, and the University of California. And he is the author of a newly released book called The Stakes: America at the Point of No Return. And last but not least is David Goldman. He has written the popular Spangler column in the Asia Times since 2001. He is a principal of Asia Times Holdings and president of Macro Strategy LLC, a consulting firm serving institutional investors. He has also headed research groups at Credit Suisse, Bank of America, Cantor Fitzgerald, and other firms. He is a regular contributor to the Claremont Review of Books and to PJ Media. Please give our panel a warm welcome. So over the past few years, there has been a lot of rethinking and reassessment of American foreign policy, in particular American foreign policy after the Cold War, reflecting on the failures of the war in Iraq and America's interventions in the Middle East. There is now sort of a new consensus that's more or less widely held on the right that those wars and interventions were largely a mistake, and also an emerging consensus that China poses the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States, although there's some debate about what exactly that means in practice. However, the pivot from the Middle East to China has gotten a little bit complicated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we'll get into that a little bit in this panel, especially because conservatives are also hotly contesting what we should do on that subject. But when many people have been reassessing foreign policy and talk about foreign policy more generally, they tend to think of it primarily in terms of the application of hard military power, and they don't often think about how economics and foreign policy work together and what other tools besides hard military power might be at our disposal. Now, some of our enemies who don't quite or haven't had the competitive edge that we do, like Russia or China, have used other economic means to wage a war on the United States. I know Ambassador Robert Lighthizer spoke about this at length yesterday, so I'm curious to get your general thoughts on that. But to begin, I'm going to put two questions to you. One has to do with theory, and one has to do with history, and then we'll move from those responses to more practical discussion. So the first question is, how do you understand the ideal relationship between the nation-state and the economy? In other words, is there a tension between individual economic liberty and the national interest, or do these two things run together? And then the second question is it possible to speak of a definitive American tradition when it comes to political economy and national security? For example, is it true that perhaps in the 19th century, economic nationalism served our interest on the world stage, but in the 20th century, economic liberalism served our interest best on the world stage? And today, do we need one or the other or some combination of the two? So first, if you could comment on the ideal relationship between nation state and economy, and second, on the American tradition of political economy and national security. And we will begin with Will.
All right. So I wrote a piece for the American Conservative, a magazine you should definitely be reading. And I talked about have faith in America, which harkened back to Calvin Coolidge's essay, Have Faith in Massachusetts. And so one of the things I would tell you today is that we ought to have faith in America, and we ought to have faith in the principles of freedom and free markets that have served conservatism and America well. So I'm in favor of a lot of the way conservatives have been thinking for 100 years, particularly in reaction to the New Deal, which is coming up on its 90th anniversary. So I'm not the person here who's going to tell you a story about how we need to radically reshape the relationship between the state and the economy. But I still think it's worth talking about some of these aspects and the nuances, because I think that a lot of times free traders get a bad deal because they are pitched as having a kind of ideal type radical approach, when most free traders in practice understand, I think, some of the nuances of living in a political economy, not just an economy. And that's why I would start by saying the ideal relationship between the state and the economy can actually never exist, right? Because we always have to consider the geostrategic context in which we live. So we should always be talking about a kind of bounded ideal. And I know that that's actually what Johnny thinks, because he's not a romantic. Sorry, maybe he is with his spousal relationship. I don't want to impugn your romance, but namely, what is that kind of bounded ideal, given the realities of our position vis-a-vis other states and the constraints of international politics? I think as a conservative and a classical liberal that the bounded ideal relationship should be limited, but is still important, right? The government has a role to play, right? It should protect private property. It should protect individual rights. It should enforce contracts. It should protect against fraud and adhere to the rule of law. It should play a proper role regulating against significant direct negative externalities. But the government, in all but a limited set of cases, should not interfere in the marketplace, leaving to individuals and aggregates of individuals, like businesses, the job of engaging in economic activity and producing wealth. In other words, we should defend free enterprise and free markets as the best way for scarce goods to be allocated and maximal wealth to be generated. Of course, there are a limited set of cases where national security reasons should trump economic and efficiency concerns. Right? I think that an adherence to free markets is not a suicide pact. So, for example, as I said yesterday, we need to make sure we don't become dependent on others for critical military platforms and technologies. We also have to be concerned about the sale of weapons and military and dual-use technologies to other countries, even friends. And we want to ensure, subject to prudence, access to key resources necessary for our society and our economic well-being, though in most cases the markets and supply chains are pretty resilient and flexible to meet our needs. Now, even though I just said that about the national security exception, which even Adam Smith accepted, as Sam Gregg said, we do have to be careful, right? We have to be careful of allowing national security considerations to be used for what are really protectionist interests, right? Either interests that are business-oriented or political reasons, right? Adam Smith talked about, you get a bunch of, businessmen together, and soon they're colluding against the public interest. And so I think we have to be wary of that also when it comes to these arguments for national security, especially because subsidies and protection can be a seedbed of corruption and cronyism. So I think that's kind of my general sense about that bounded ideal, Johnny.
Do you have any comments on
the historically? Yeah, I mean, look, I think that clearly the tariff was a more prominent part of our politics in the 19th century. I think sometimes we have to remember, though, that this is before the income tax, the national income tax, and so it was a major source of revenue. And it's also the case that the United States was a developing country as opposed to a mega economy in a developed world. And so I think that the use of, say, the arguments of that time, one, I think they overstate the extent to which protectionism was core to our development. And two, I think that even if I granted those arguments, it was a different time, and I'm not sure they're as applicable today.
Thanks. Michael.
I mean, to the first question, obviously there's a tension between individual economic freedom and national needs or national security. I mean, to make it sort of absurd, take this to an absurd extreme, but that makes the point. Like, if there weren't, then Newport News shipbuilding would make fleet carriers for China. Why not? Its stock price would go up. It employs a lot of people. You know, it's great for the supply chain and so on, but we don't do that. We do things that are nearly as stupid, but at least we don't do anything like that. We've sort of always, throughout the history of the Republic, understood that there are limits to economic freedom, both in the terms of what we'll sell to other countries, what we'll export, and also industries, you know, that we will, as Will points out, that we will protect at home, even if some other economy, under the law of comparative advantage, can produce a particular good better, cheaper, we will still make it at home in a less efficient, more expensive way so as to be able to control our own destiny. And this is something that Alexander Hamilton argued from the very beginning of the Republic, that the United States cannot be in a position where it needs, in a much obviously less sophisticated technological environment, you know, we can't be put in a position where we need to be importing materials in order to equip the Continental Army or the U.S. Navy. Well, it wasn't at that point. By the time he writes, it's no longer the Continental Army. There's no doubt about it. The question is where to find the line. And the line, I think, has been crossed too many times recently. A very short history lesson. If you remember, this was a very big live issue in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president. It had been pretty much an accepted practice for the United States to severely restrict these so-called dual-use technologies up to that point. And after the end of the Cold War, many, many defense contractors, for obvious reasons, wanted to see those restrictions loosened because they wanted to go into overseas markets so they could make more money. And they lobbied Washington very, very hard on the notion that the threat was not as great, therefore these restrictions are outmoded, or they need to be somewhat in place, but they don't need to be quite as restrictive as they used to be. And Clinton gave in and loosened these restrictions. He paid a pretty high political cost for that. It was a great issue for the Republicans to beat him up over. There were some scandals involved where a lot of his biggest donors just so happened to be some of the people who ran these firms and most wanted the restrictions lifted. But after having paid that political cost, we never really went back as a country. And I think we're still too loose about this. Every once in a while, you'll see something pop up in the Washington Post. If you read it, I don't, but some of you might. The so-called CFIUS process, where something does get turned down, an application for sale of a dual use or a weapons technology. And the reason why those stories stick out is because they're actually pretty rare. Most of this stuff gets approved. It's become almost a formality, and I think we need to take another look at that and tighten it up. The flip side, and then I'll address the second half of this, is some things we do are designed to be sold abroad, and the whole program depends on it. So a great example is the very much maligned, controversial F-35, which I've been studying a little bit lately. And yes, it's way over budget, it costs a lot of money, it's all of this and more and all of that. And yet, one of the reasons, if we're going to recoup the investment in that project, it was designed from the beginning, unlike certain other planes which we consider too sophisticated to sell to anybody, including our closest allies, like the F-22. The F-35 was designed from the beginning with all kinds of security considerations in mind and built in so that it would be sellable to allies and that the United States government and the taxpayers could recoup much of the R&D and investment through those sales, right? And this is how you offset the cost of what's going to end up being, I've heard estimates that say that by the time the last F-35 is built at whatever, it's going to be something like 26 or 2,700 of them, the whole thing from beginning to end will cost about $1 trillion, right? But much of that $1 trillion will be offset by allies buying it. One more advantage, right? And again, if we're talking about foreign policy restraint here, so some of you may not care about this, but it matters if you're in the U.S. military and you ever have to do an operation with allies. Interoperability which I don't want to go to in super great length, but it does make Allied operations much more efficient, much more effective in terms of the planning and the implementation if the air forces working together on a particular mission are all flying the same plane and using the same systems and can work together and talk to one another. That's not a trivial factor in how this stuff works. So to the second half of that, I don't want to go through the whole history. I just want to make one key point, which is that question was a good setup too. The United States did liberalize its trading practices in the immediate post-World War II era for precisely political and not for economic reasons, okay? And I've made this point so often, if any of you were at any of those earlier panels where I said it and you think the old man is repeating himself, I apologize, but it's relevant, right? We, as the senior people in the Truman administration and then in the Eisenhower administration, got together and with a clear understanding that liberalizing these trading practices would have a deleterious effect on certain US industries, certain US jobs, and so on, that it was worth it to pay that cost in order to A, rebuild the economies of Europe and East Asia from the devastations of war, and B, hold together an alliance against communism. In that sense, I would say the 1945 to 1965 wave of trade liberalization, which continued there, which then thereafter continued or was held in place, I would say for the national security rationale for that, the diplomatic or grand strategic rationale for that has long since gone away. But having served 6 years in the national security bureaucracy, I can tell you that it is still taken for granted by the people who hold these roles that it's always in US interests to be free with our trading, not from an economic perspective. They don't even really pay attention to the economics anymore. That it's a national security or diplomatic or foreign policy or in our strategic interests. And I'm not sure that it is anymore. I'm certainly sure it isn't across the board the way it used to be assumed. And we don't look at it, from my experience, on a case-by-case basis as to what's actually best for us, both in terms of our strategic needs and in what it does to the domestic economy. So I think Will and I are going to disagree a little bit here. I think by hitting this gas pedal way too hard in the post-Cold War era, especially after WTO accession for China, operating under this assumption, we hurt the domestic economy to such a degree that we ended up causing political blowback that gets you Donald Trump, among other things, and that I think ultimately has hurt and will continue to hurt our national security. So we're not striking the right balance today, and we need to think about that and get back to an earlier balance, in my view.
Thanks, Michael. David.
I believe that national interest and economic freedom coincide identically, that in a sense they're consubstantial. Freedom only has a meaning as creativity. Creativity expresses itself in economies through innovation. In the absence of innovation, the natural state of economies is rent-seeking monopolies, torpor, and relative poverty. The periods which have generated meaningful innovations in the United States have been almost entirely associated with the national requirements to win wars or prevent wars, particularly the great forge of freedom of the Second World War, the space program under John F. Kennedy, the military buildup in the Carter administration and Reagan administration, which invented the digital world. As far as economic theory is concerned, one of the reasons I didn't become an economist is because economics has nothing of any importance to say about innovation, at least in terms of mathematical models. There are good books about it, like Ned Phelps's Mass Flourishing, Schumpeter, and so forth. However, the kind of work, for example, for which Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize in innovation is really mathematically trivial and wrong. What we've seen in the United States is that the impact of decisive innovations, which under the space program involved a federal commitment to R&D of 2.5% of GDP and about 1.2% of GDP under Reagan, much larger than today, created relative advantages which really made things like tariffs and trade restrictions trivial, because when we created the digital world, we invented the integrated circuit, mass manufacturing of integrated circuit, plasma screens, the GUI interface, the internet, absolutely everything that involves the modern economy We did things no one else in the world could do at any price. So how we priced them, manipulated tariffs, was a trivial and unimportant question. We determined to win the Cold War, and we won it. In 1983, as a very young man, I wrote a memo for the National Security Council arguing that SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, would pay for itself many times over. It was a terrible paper in terms of methodology, but it happened to be right. That's our history. Now we face a China that's determined to dominate what's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the combination of artificial intelligence and broadband communications and automation. They've gone a long way towards doing it. If you don't believe me, go to YouTube and look up Chinese port automation, Chinese warehouse automation, Chinese factory automation, and see what's happening. This is an existential threat to the status of the United States in the world. The kind of things we did in the past, which is to mobilize our resources for innovation, did not involve the state picking winners. We had a very clear distinction in public-private partnerships between federal support for basic physics and chemistry and so forth, for fundamental research, and private risk in commercialization. That worked extremely well. It created the longest peacetime expansion in American history and transformed the world, won the Cold War. If we wish to stay ahead of China, tariffs, in my view, are a trivial issue. We now import $700 billion a year of goods from China. Before the tariffs, it was $400 billion. It simply hasn't worked. I agree with the spirit of much of what Ambassador Lighthizer said, but as far as the single-minded emphasis in tariffs, that parrot's dead. The numbers simply don't support it. The only thing and the key thing that will determine whether we or China are the dominant power in the world is American innovation. And the thing that scares me the most is that instead of spending 1% of GDP on federal development, we spend 0.3% of GDP. Our rate of innovation has collapsed. We've done it before. Our history attests to our capacity to do it, and that is the key to freedom because, as I said, freedom is a meaningless concept outside of creativity and innovation. Thank you.
Thanks, David. You touched on Ambassador Lighthizer's defense of tariffs vis-a-vis China, and I want to turn to Will here. I know Will and I have had some debates back in the day at TAC about the China issue and what to do about it, and I'm curious, two things. What did you make of the case that Ambassador Lighthizer put forward yesterday? And secondly, on the matter of economic competition with China, particularly their One Belt, One Road initiative or other ways in which they're using the economy to perhaps sabotage American interests, what type of response, if not tariffs, then what type of response do you think might be merited?
Sure, thank you. There was so much in that talk last night worthy of discussion, so it's hard to
you have the floor, so.
Yeah, we only have 37 more minutes, though. What I would say is that the economics and politics of the following statement that he made, that higher prices and lower consumption are a good thing, was remarkable, right? You could almost imagine the Biden White House shrinking from such an argument to defend inflation, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine that selling in politics, and also higher prices and lower consumption might be easy to say, you know, if you live in the Beltway in a super zip code. But, you know, when you're someone struggling, particularly those of Americans who have not been on the escalator of economic wealth creation over the last 20 years, it's hard to imagine that being an exciting agenda. So I think that was a problem. I mean, the other thing, too, is just the issue with things like Belt and Road and other state managed efforts. I just don't think that these are going to be, at the end of the day, are going to be found to be all that effective at providing for China's national interests. I think oftentimes we get over-exaggerate the threat of these things, and we underemphasize the potential for inefficiencies, waste, and the unintended consequence of causing others to respond in kind, either foolishly in kind by doing our own kind of economic support to inefficient support to other countries in that area, or in terms of it provoking a balancing response by neighboring countries who may fear it, right? And I think oftentimes we underappreciate the importance of how states have a natural tendency to balance threats in the international system. And as the more China is seen to be a threat, the more likely other states, India, Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, Philippines, et cetera, will naturally tend to balance. And I think that we should be trying to buck pass the costs of containing China to others. That's the brilliance of being a balancer of last resort, right? Whether it was the British experience or even our experience in World War I and World War II, is others suffer more of the cost to even meet interests of your own. And I think we should always be wanting the Japanese and other countries to be spending more money and more blood to satisfy our national security concerns than the good people of the United States.
Thanks, Will. Michael, question for you, given that your domain was strategic communications for the White House. There was a mantra in the Trump administration that economic security is national security. So I'm curious, what does that mean, or what did that mean? What does that mean to you? And also, I wonder if you can comment how it seemed like there were different factions of the White House who understood that quite differently. You had General Robert Spalding. For him, that meant sort of a nationalized 5G network to compete with Huawei. For others, it perhaps meant, we need to deregulate, cut taxes to make American industries more competitive with China. So, as the communications guy, what's going on there?
It's an ink blot. It's a Rorschach. So when I teach students, I give them excerpts of these documents called the National Security Strategy of the United States, which the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 requires each administration to draft and submit to Congress, and they're public. And one of the things that becomes apparent as you read them historically, I don't assign them all, I'm not that cruel, but I give a couple to look at, is the ever-expanding umbrella under which the term national, or I lost my metaphor, but national security comes to mean everything, right? So with each successive document, more and more things are forced into this category of crucial to our national security until, school lunches are national security. Well, how? Well, because if the kid doesn't get lunch and he won't study hard, he won't grow up to be big and strong, and we won't have a military, or we won't have people making the munitions somewhere. So school lunches, it's just absolutely everything. Bee stings are national security, right? And we've lost sight of what that phrase is supposed to mean and how to look at particular problems narrowly and solve them. So what does economic security is national security mean? What does it mean to me? Well, for one thing, it means let's not sell, sensitive nuclear technology to hostile countries. Let's not sell dual-use technology to countries that may not be hostile, but that also may not have our best interests at heart in copying them or passing them along to adversaries. Let's violate the law of comparative advantage and protect certain industries that we need to keep domestically to keep the military going. I think we need to do all of those. I would include what David said. We need to innovate. We need to get back the innovation that's resulted in all kinds of technology. I mentioned the F-35. Stealth technology is a result of R&D innovation of exactly the kind that David talked about that ultimately did not come in the first instance from a free market, but from government investment. All of that stuff is, to me, economic security as national security, narrowly understood, and I guess broadly understood. You don't really have national security unless you have a healthy populace, and this is where I get more, populist, is I don't think you can have a healthy populace with the kind of blue economy that it seems the coastal elites want to create that absolutely hollows out the middle of the country and strip mines certain industries and basically makes the whole world is bankers, app coders, and baristas. And there's nobody left in the American economy because, that's all we need, according to this vision. I'm from Northern California. It already kind of looks like that, and it's got a lot of problems.
But could I jump in real quick? Sure. There's a little bit of a contradiction here. And again, Michael, you and I agree on so many things. But if you're talking about all the innovation that we're going to pay for with government that David talks about, and let's assume it's efficient, then that technology is going to be the thing that's going to drive a lot of the job losses in the middle of the country. I mean, there's been good empirical research that has shown that most of what is the so-called China shock is actually due to changes in technology that have allowed for automation and disruption of the domestic economy, not something that's foreign. So the more you guys, do government-supported technologies, the possibility is that more and more people are going to be out of those traditional jobs. So let's make sure we understand that contradiction.
The Reagan era saw an explosion of new industries which hadn't existed before, particularly computation, cable television, and so forth, which were made possible by innovations in the 1970s. And although their factory employment was stagnant during the Reagan years, employment exploded, and high-paid employment because of the new industries. That's not what I'd like to argue about. I would like, however, to say something about Belt and Road. What China did between 1979 and the present is to take dirt farmers who made it less than $200 a year and turn them into semi-skilled industrial workers and service people who made purchasing power parity adjusted $15,000 or $20,000 a year, depending on how you calculate it. Quite a spectacular success. Belt and Road is designed to assimilate another 1.5 billion or 2 billion people into the Chinese model and do the same thing to them. There are many spectacular failures with Belt and Road based on bureaucracy, corruption, government stupidity, and so forth. However, Belt and Road as a whole has been one of the greatest successes in economic history. As of June, we reached a landmark, what I called a point of no return, in a piece you'll find on the Asia Times website today, where China now exports more to the global south than it does to the US and Europe combined. Just in the past 2 years, its exports to the global south have doubled. I know how this was done because inadvertently I was part of it. I was the investment banker who brought Huawei into Mexico in 2014 and helped them get the contract to build a national broadband network. They weren't simply building a broadband network. Huawei came in and said, we're not just going to sell you the hardware, we're going to create a whole ecosystem. We'll transform your economy. We'll make you like China. You'll get e-commerce, e-finance, all the apps. We'll basically sino-form you. We will assimilate you. So now, for example, in Indonesia, 275 million people, largest country in Southeast Asia, China, Carnegie Endowment had a wonderful report on this a couple of weeks ago. China is not only building their broadband network, they're training the entire government in cybersecurity. They've taken over Indonesia's digital economy. They're doing that in Brazil, they've done it in Mexico, and that's what's driving this spectacular export growth on China's part. Now, if that is a devastating national security threat for the United States, remember that in the case of the Ukraine sanctions, none of the BRICS, virtually none of the global south, voted to support the sanctions. They, including India, which is our not quite ally, but partner of sorts in the Quad. If China gets its hooks into developing countries and makes them de facto provinces of China, well, first of all, they solve the demographic problem because they hook 1 billion people with young population into the Chinese economy. But they also create soft power, which in any kind of dispute with the United States would put countries with a couple of billion people on China's side, not on our side. And long term, you can already do all this trade in Asia in local currencies. You don't need the US dollar. There are $400 billion of local currency swap lines among Asian central banks. There are apps that will allow a consumer in Thailand to go to Singapore and pay for things on his Thai bank account without going through dollars. The possibility, which is not immediate, but it's a serious threat, that the US dollar could be eliminated as the vehicle medium for a great deal of international trade threatens us because, as Ambassador Lighthizer correctly pointed out yesterday, with an $18 trillion negative net foreign investment position, we're so much in hock to the rest of the world that if they don't use our assets for transaction purposes, the role of the dollar and our investment position may be compromised, and that would be a very grave problem. We'd look like Britain in the 1960s when sterling ceased to be reserve currency. So that has profound strategic implications.
Will, Michael, any responses to that point?
No, I don't disagree with it. I also don't believe that I know enough about this to evaluate what he said. I usually learn from David about China. I don't have anything to teach David about China.
I mean, I think some of those bigger, challenges in terms of the reserve currency, those are things I think David is right to be concerned about. What I would say, though, is that, we should be skeptical, though, of a lot of the Chinese activities in the developing world as being necessarily power augmenting as opposed to potentially power detracting. A lot of America's misadventures in the developing world have been things that have been more trouble than they're worth. Now, the Chinese are being a bit smarter in the sense that they're trying to, help with infrastructure or extract resources rather than trying to do democracy promotion. Democracy promotion is probably not as efficient at promoting the kind of core national interests as those other things. But one thing we should also realize that in a globalized economy, if the Chinese do pay for the cost of some of this infrastructure development and resource extraction, that because natural resources are globalized commodities and have global prices, the United States does actually benefit from that without having to pay for the cow. Now, the issue there is, though, are they going to have preferential treatment in some ways in terms of geopolitics? And that's why I think this whole conversation has to go back to actually fundamentals about grand strategy. And so if this were in the 1940s, I would be much more worried and probably be where David is on this than today, especially because we know the ramifications of the nuclear revolution. We have all kinds of other advantages. And because of the fact that we live in a world in which the balance of power is relatively stable in terms of Eurasia, that I'm less worried that some of these advantages, even if they do turn out the way David talks about, will be able to adhere in a great enough cost for us that we want to roil some of the international waters and international cooperation that is to our benefit with some of these countries, including China, which is a nuanced issue, right? They are both our most important strategic adversary and one of our more important strategic partners, economic partners. And that makes things much more complicated than, say, the Cold War, in which we had almost no relationship economically other than with agriculture with the Soviet Union.
Well, I will say, and I doubt David will give this much credence, but I do believe it's true, and it picks up something Will did say earlier, that as China gets more bossy, it lines up nations against them. I mean, Edward Litwack has been making this point for a decade. The anti-China containment alliance in Asia that he predicted around 2012 or whenever has not emerged. It may still be emerging, it may yet never emerge, but they're not making friends everywhere they go. The resentments that they create in these countries that they invest in and they build projects in and they send their people to and stuff like that, that resentment may not be large enough to prevent the emergence of what David is talking about, but it's a factor that should make us wonder because it's there. And they certainly, Americans like to pat ourselves on the back, and occasionally we deserve it. And America really did have an extremely good reputation in most of the world in the post-World War II era for 20 or 30 years after that, as being the one country that you could count on to come in and help you out and build projects and do things that would treat you fairly, treat you right, and you would actually benefit from, that wasn't out to get you or rip you off or something. To say the least, China does not have that reputation in much of the world, and as I said, whether that means that they won't be able to pull off the dream that David described, I don't know, but it's a factor, and it leaves a question mark open.
I think Mike is absolutely right about that. Ed Lutwack and I were both working for Andy Marshall at Office of Net Assessment when he wrote the original paper for Andy, which turned into his book. Chinese diplomacy is one of the most incompetent and defective products of the human spirit in all of history. Everyone hates them. They're nasty bullies. So it's amazing that the Indonesians, who really don't like the Chinese, have had anti-Chinese pogroms in the past, have really opened the kimono completely and turned over the whole cybersphere, their whole digital economy, to the Chinese. Same with the Philippines, which had conflicts with the Chinese in the South China Sea. Bongbong Marcos won election with a 2/3 popular majority on a pro-Chinese platform. So yes, all these factors are true, but China nonetheless has been making astonishing progress, much faster than I would have expected. Now, Mike is absolutely right. People like us better. If we and the Japanese and the Koreans, maybe the Germans, had gotten together to do the kind of things that China is doing, which is not simply build a road or a bridge, but help train the economies, help transform them into modern economies that would raise the living standards of their people, 100 times over, they'd much rather deal with us than the Chinese. But we haven't done it. That's my frustration.
So one question I have is who's the we that we're talking about that's going to do this? Because I look at the State Department or the Defense Department or Commerce, I just see a lot of incompetency. So are we really going to be effective at these people providing a kind of Swiss clock-like development program? And I mean, we could, the challenges we saw over the last 20 years in nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, we showed how incompetent we were at this. So who's going to do it? Again, I admit that on some projects, right, you've seen DARPA funding be effective at meeting certain needs. I question some of the costs of, say, NASA, relative to what you got. Because if you spend a ton of money, just like the Soviets spent a ton of money doing certain things and they got results, but was it efficient? But even if I grant that, I still wonder who's going to do these great projects of transforming other countries. If you're saying that private businesses can take the lead in that, I'm expecting that they can do that out of self-interest, right?
Well, you need public-private partnerships. My quick answer is put David Malpass of the World Bank in charge of it. They do a good job.
So that's the conservative position, is have a World Bank head?
Oh, David Malpass was a Trump guy. He's a good conservative.
I like Trump guys like the next guy, but they haven't overcome the basic problems that Hayek talks about in terms of the knowledge problem, right?
Well, I agree with you. Our bureaucracy is not up to the job. However, there is a job. China is hardwiring into its economy the world's young people. The single scarcest resource in the world, after all, is young people. We're all aging. All societies are aging. That's the biggest long-term problem we all have. The scarcest resource is working-age people who can be educated, follow instructions, and work in a modern economy. That's why, for example, large parts of the world which have a lot of young people are not going to be integrated, like Africa. Southeast Asia, 600 million people. Brazil, 300 million people. These are places which can be integrated, and the Chinese are getting their dibs in. Vietnam has already become a Chinese offshore manufacturing colony. I'm told you can't hire 5,000 workers for a new factory in Vietnam. It's all booked out. Mexico, Ambassador Lighthizer talked about reshoring close to shore through Mexico. Who do you think built their infrastructure? Who's building their factories? Who's selling their capital goods? 16% of Mexico's imports are from China right now. Chinese are all over that trade. They looked at their own history of raising dirt farmers into prosperous industrial workers and said, we're going to apply that model to the rest of the world and take the vigorish out of it. That is a strategic risk to us. Exactly how we go about it, honestly, you're right. It's a terrible challenge. We don't have the people to do it. But if we do nothing, then we have a strategic setback because China will do it and we won't.
So could we agree on one thing? I think this is an important turn here, which is I think most of our problems in the United States are due to our domestic challenges, right? That if we have faith in the kind of the American way here, and we can compete with anyone. And so I think we could all agree here that which side of some of the small disagreements that we have, David, which side of that, one of the big problems, right, with domestically is that our universities and colleges, because of things like wokeness and bad ideology, some of which are Marxist inspired, that these are going to be basically kind of cutting our Achilles in our ability to run against the Chinese, whether they're a really super threat or they're just a major adversary, right? And we need to find ways to solve the problem of wokeness and to get our universities focused on knowledge creation rather than this kind of madness.
Amen and hallelujah. Only 7% of our undergraduates now study engineering. It's 33% in China. China produces 7 times more engineers and comp science graduates than we do. Federal aid should not support resentment studies. It should support the kind of things that the National Defense Act Education Act of 1957 did, and that made the space program possible. I couldn't agree more.
I think it's time for audience questions now, but as we're waiting for those audience questions, David, I want to put one more potential pushback to you in terms of your approach, which is the military-industrial complex. Realism and advocates of realism and restraint often, I think rightly, cite the financial interest pursued by the big defense contractors as one of the main reasons why we stay engaged in foreign wars against our own interests. So what sort of safeguards would you put on your defense industrial-based spending to ensure that it doesn't
absolutely. What we have now is probably the greatest instance of institutional corruption, at least in financial terms, in history. The defense industry sells us the same systems year in, year out, including a lot of antiquated stuff, and we pay for it. They don't innovate. The defense industry never liked to innovate. It's expensive and it's uncertain. They like to get cost plus for exactly the same stuff they sold us 10 years ago. The only ultimate safeguard against corruption and collusion and cronyism is innovation, because if DARPA is out there saying we need laser weapons that'll shoot down the Chinese missiles that might be able to sink American aircraft carriers, if Raytheon won't do it, Lockheed will. If Lockheed won't, some startup will, and they may put them out of business. So forcing the frontier of physics for defense is critical. Now, I believe peace comes from balance of power. If you want peace, you prepare for war. Right now, we have an imbalance. If we had a kinetic situation, God forbid, in the Western Pacific, close to the Chinese coast, we probably lose it. That makes the Chinese arrogant and adventurous and may lead to miscalculation. They're no longer afraid of us, as they were, say, when Bill Clinton sailed a couple of aircraft carriers close to Taiwan in that last crisis, and was it 96 and 97? 96. So we want to make them afraid of us, not by threatening to invade them or drop bombs on them, but being able to neutralize the massive investment they've made in anti-ship missiles, submarines, interceptor aircraft, and so forth. So I think a military policy which focuses on protecting the homeland, protecting our military assets, and would improve the balance of power and increase the likelihood of maintaining the peace. I personally believe that a war with China would be the single greatest calamity that ever happened to the world, and that we should do everything possible to avoid it.
Great. Well, let's do 20 minutes of questions, actually go to 350. And I'll also note we have not yet discussed Ukraine and Russia, so bonus points to whoever throws that into the mix.
Well, our first question, which is from the app, addresses just that. So given the ongoing hot war situation in Ukraine, and then also, I guess, off of David's most recent comment about potential war with China, which would we say is more likely to occur, a war with China or a war with Russia?
More likely. You might as well flip a coin with this administration in power. I have no idea what they're thinking or doing. I'm not sure any of them do either. They seem, it would probably be uncharitable of me to say that they seem to want both, but they seem not to want to moderate their rhetoric or actions in ways that might avoid both. So kind of take your pick, heads Ukraine, tails China, or Russia, tails China.
Well, they're very different dynamics. The risk in Ukraine is that American military assets are used to strike targets inside Russia, and the Russians respond with tactical nuclear weapons, let's say. If we give them HIMARS, which hit Russian cities, the Russians might respond in a very serious way. So it's a matter of preventing the Ukrainians from going over the deep end and provoking a war. In the case of China, the issue is Taiwan. Taiwan is an existential issue from the standpoint of China. It's a province of China attempting to promote its independence is the same thing as saying we want to break up China. There's a lot to be said about it. I wrote a book about that a couple of years ago, but in a nutshell, if China believes that the United States is pursuing the independence of Taiwan, and of course the Biden administration has said that it is not doing so, then it very well might preemptively attack Taiwan to prevent that scenario from unfolding. And the best book to read on that is a superb thriller by James Stavridis, Admiral, retired, former head of the Pacific Fleet, called 2034, about how that situation could lead to a nuclear exchange between the United States and China. I've got nothing better to say than Stavridis wrote.
Let me say one thing about picking up on what David said about Ukraine. So far as any of us knows, American weaponry, NATO weaponry, has not done the things that he's talked about, as far as we know. What has been reported, which I can't independently confirm, but sounds plausible to me, is that intelligence that we have been feeding to the Ukrainians has been used. I don't know if you know this, but an unusual number of high-ranking Russian officers has died in this war. That is to say, if you go back and you look at World War II or Vietnam tables or Iraq or Afghanistan, and you try to count up the number of 4 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars who actually died, it's really low, almost to the point of non-existent. The Russians have lost a surprisingly high number of general officers in a very short amount of time. And it has been reported that that is because the United States or NATO or allied intelligence services are feeding this information to the Ukrainians who don't really have the equipment or the means to get it on their own. If that is happening, you can bet Putin knows it, and it makes him really angry at us. And yet, he has not yet escalated beyond what he's doing right now in the theater of war. I would say, though, if NATO and the White House and whoever keeps on doing this or takes it to another level, you might see some of the things David talks about. And I personally regard that as extraordinarily risky behavior on our part, assuming it's happening. I say all of these caveats because I don't want the FBI to do a pre-dawn raid for leaking classified information that I haven't seen, just to be clear. They're into that now, the no-knock, your door's coming down, you're going out on the lawn in your underwear type of thing. I'd like to avoid that if possible. Especially since I don't really see a core strategic interest of the United States in prolonging this war. And let's be clear, I hate to have to say this, but all we can do is prolong it. Given the tremendous economic, manpower, military, and other imbalances between Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine cannot defeat the Russians. Ukraine can only defeat the Russians if NATO goes all in, and then we do have a nuclear war on our hands, in all likelihood. So I also think what we're doing is kind of cynical, which is feeding them just enough stuff to keep this going, which at the end of the day, it may be a moral crime that Russia invaded Ukraine and will end up defeating Ukraine, but it's also a kind of fact on the ground that we don't have the ability to change unless we take over the operation ourselves and risk a wider war. So there's something cynical about keeping this fight going when the ultimate end of it is going to be the same either way, except that the Ukrainian population and infrastructure will be a lot worse the longer it goes on than the sooner it ends.
Yeah, well said.
Let's move to the next question.
Thank you. So we have another question from the app, and this is directed to David. So someone is asking, many conservatives and libertarians would say that government or federal investment in R&D is not economic freedom. Rather, it is government intervention, and investment should be left to private actors. How does government investment coincide with economic freedom, and why are the two not dichotomous?
Well, freedom as a concept, as I said, makes no sense in the absence of creativity. If we can't do something new, then we live in a machine with self-regulating rules, and everything's going to be the same, and all outcomes are going to be predetermined. And as Frank Knight said, everybody's return is going to be the rate of interest plus the cost of insurance. And it's a very dull world indeed. The unknown unknowns are the kind of things that governments subsidize. No private company can justify to its stockholders spending money on things with no apparent commercial use. To give you an example, how do we, the process which produces fast, light, powerful chips, CMOS manufacturing, was key to the digital age. That made chips proliferate into everything. That happened because somebody at the Pentagon decided that it would be cool to let fighter pilots do weather forecasting in the cockpit. And it happened that RCA Labs at the time had gotten some patents from Fairchild, and they had some engineers who found a way to make this thing work. And once you got these chips, they had 1,000 other applications. By 1978, they were doing look-down radar in F-15s. Every single invention of the digital age came from a DARPA subsidy, but not one of them ended up doing what the original subsidy was supposed to do. Someone took something, discovered something, and found a different use for it. So when you don't know what the commercial purpose of something is or the ultimate use is, you can't find private funds to do it. That's where the government should use public goods to subsidize research at the frontier of science. Once you know what the technology does, then I believe government should not pick winners, entrepreneurs should raise money from private capital markets, and it should be entirely a matter of private risk. And that division of labor worked for us brilliantly in the past, and I think that should satisfy people who think that free markets are the best thing, as I do, as well as people who believe that national security is of the essence.
I'm going to mention the F-35 again, and you're going to think I'm on the payroll of Lockheed Martin. I wish, because I hear they pay people a lot of money, but not me. So I know people in the Navy. I hang around the Navy a lot. I was talking to somebody in the Navy a few months ago, and I said, "What's the deal? Basically, what's the deal with this plane? You know, I haven't paid that much attention to it lately, but is it back on?" Because they just, for the first time, the Navy declared combat ready a squadron of F-35s. So even though this plane's been in development forever, the Air Force has had it, I think, since 2006 or something. The Navy finally declared combat ready a squadron, so it will be deployed if it needs to be deployed. And he said, it's great. Let me tell you, we had an exercise, and I may get the numbers wrong, where they fly against so-called adversary squadrons. So the adversary squadrons are flying all kinds of different US and European jets to test it out against these. And he says the record that day was 76-1 or something. Like it lost one encounter and it won 76 encounters. Now that's because of this kind of technology. Stealth technology and the other technologies that are in this plane would never be developed in the private sector because as far as I can tell, they don't have any commercial applications, or I don't want to think about what the commercial application of stealth aircraft might be. It's pretty sinister. But if you consider, I talked about how rarely general officers get killed in American wars, even as badly as some of our recent wars have gone. Another thing that happens so rarely that when it happens, it's big news, is American planes getting shot down or losing in an air-to-air combat situation. It just doesn't happen anymore because our technology is so good and has been so good, and the pilots are very well trained, I don't want to leave them out of it, is so good. We wouldn't have that. Now, let's hope we don't get into an aerial combat situation with a peer competitor power that can field stealth-capable fighters, in which it's more 50-50. But to the extent that the military has to operate in areas against countries that don't have that, they can do so with basically impunity and with low to no casualties because of this technology that the private sector would not ever bother to develop. So I think there is a purpose to this at the end of the day.
All right, and we are now going to move into rapid fire question round. So let's do 2 questions in a row. So if we can get 2 questions over there, and then let's give 30-second responses.
So I want to focus in on what I'll call a significant silence of this panel. We had Michael Anton talk about how trade with other countries after the Cold War is not as much of a national security necessity anymore. But we had David Goldman talk about how China seems to be having these, building up these financial and trade relationships with other countries. And this just makes me wonder if it might have been a good idea for the US to have done something like that. Say, a partnership encompassing multiple nations, transversing the Pacific perhaps. By the way, the TPP did end up happening, but without the United States. And maybe there was something wrong with TPP, but I'm just wondering if there's a possible utility to something like it in the sort of geostrategic arena that you're describing here.
Well, I want to do 2 questions?
Two questions.
Okay.
What is the methodology for assessing if another foreign entity is an ally or an adversary that we should or should not engage in trade or strategic partnerships with?
Okay, well, to the second question, very easily, some allies are literally written into statutes. There are federal statutes that say you're an ally. You can be either a NATO ally or declared in law a major non-NATO ally. Beyond that, as I said, there's a process called CFIUS, which starts with a C, and I don't remember the acronym off the top of my head. But if it is a question of whether this technology ought to be sold, it goes through a review, and it is looked at from the perspective of trying to balance economic and national security considerations with national security considerations taking precedence, and the CFIUS process can result in a transfer or sale being denied on national security grounds. As for the TPP, whatever it was, it certainly was not the kind of direct investment that David is talking about that China practices with other countries. It was a horse of an entirely different breed. Even if you think it was a mistake for the United States to withdraw from it, it wasn't that. So that's really an apples to oranges comparison.
Great. 2 more questions over here.
Yeah, so I would assume everyone would agree that China is the biggest growing threat. My question is about Russia, and rewind, if you go back in time, before the invasion and everything, this U.S. policy towards Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union has just kind of seemed like needless antagonism, because you look at Russia and the United States, and Russia is a conservative Christian country, and they're in a very geostrategically important spot. So if you could go back in time, do you think that Russia would have made a viable ally or partner to use to counter China?
I think Russia is so Russian.
Hold on real quick, Mike. We'll go to the next question as well.
Oh, okay. This is a question for anyone. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on sort of the rise of China as competition, creating an external threat that might ameliorate some of our cultural problems here at home. Do you think that people will still be having questions about, or will care about questions like, is mathematics racist when China is producing 7 times as many engineers as we are?
I don't think there was any way very quickly to make Russia an ally. It's just the differences are too profound and so on. But we definitely could and should have antagonized them less, and had we done so, we would not be in as bad a position as we are today.
Will, any comment on whether the China threat can be used for cultural renewal?
We should hope that the threat isn't so severe that it'll cause that good effect at home. We'll have bigger problems.
All right.
But just on the Russia stuff, I mean, our policy towards Russia has been just terrible. I don't like Putin. I don't like the regime there. I care about America first, second, and third. But the fact is that we have not been supporting America first, second, and third with our approaches. And also, I would say we've actually had the unintended consequence of hurting some of the people we ostensibly care for, namely Ukrainians. I think it was a mistake for us to induce moral hazard in Georgia and Ukraine through the holding out hope for NATO expansion. I think when statesmen have gone to places like Ukraine and Georgia and basically said, you're practically part of NATO already, we support your sovereignty, this has not been a good thing, especially because, as Michael said earlier, and I wrote recently in the National Interest, Ukraine is just not strategically important to the United States. It's just not that valuable. We won the Cold War without them. They're not critical. They're a dagger pointed at the heart of nowhere in America. And so this has been a major screw-up on our part, which is not to say that Russia is a good actor or would behave in a responsible way, but it's been inserting us into something that could lead to some of the dangerous scenarios that Michael and David talked about without there being a strategic interest on the line. That would be very different if we were talking about Germany or the UK or Mexico or the United States itself.
All right. Let's take these 3 questions real quick, right in a row.
So in many ways, I would say China is a dying civilization, quite literally in terms of just their population. So I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is them lashing out before they encounter some very serious problems that they're going to have. My main question is, do you think Americans have the resolve to actually stand up to China anymore if they actually acted in a very aggressive fashion towards Taiwan, towards South Korea, or do you think we're withdrawn enough to this point that we wouldn't do anything?
The great danger. Oh, two more. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for the panel. It's been really great. My question is at a very practical level. We've all talked about the technological stagnation that the U.S. is seeing and our increasing inability to produce like enough STEM graduates and things like that. What is the short-term strategy to address increasing Chinese technological dominance? Because a lot of the things we've talked about, like reforming education, reforming DARPA grants, et cetera, like these are all long-term things with long lead times. What's the short-term response?
And then last question, how do we resolve the tension between Silicon Valley and the defense establishment? We're at the point where any sort of innovation or advancement comes solely from out west, and there's a calcified mindset that refuses to look to new solutions that come from the civilian space.
Well, Silicon Valley and Wall Street have been gigantic sinkholes for talent, people who could be developing new products that benefit humanity or make us more secure, or finding better ways to tweak derivatives and cheat their customers, or develop apps that turn kids into zombies and so forth. So I think the fact that big tech in the United States, for the most part, refuses to cooperate with the Defense Department is a scandal and a disgrace. And if they don't, we should find ways of, let's say, restricting their ability to hire. In terms of dealing with China in the short term, do we have the resolve? Resolve is a tricky thing. You go to war with the army you have, but you don't go to war with the army that you don't have. And what worries me about the Biden administration is that instead of peace through strength, what we've got is provocation from weakness. And that you don't tease the bear or the dragon when you can't stand up to him. I think we need a certain kind of detente which just calls a strategic halt while we retrench and develop our capabilities over time, because it will take us a while.
Great. We have one last question, 2 minutes left. Here we go.
Last question, simple yes, no. Last night, Ambassador Lighthizer criticized the claim that trade brings peace between trading partners. And curious, the three of you, what you think, given the volume of trade between the United States and China, do you think Beijing would forego conflict with the United States in order to keep that source of revenue open to its economy?
Yeah, as the classical liberal here who should appreciate these classical liberal arguments of the 19th century, they're wrong. There's been good empirical research as well as just a casual perusal of history will show that on the margins there may be some conflict-reducing aspect of trade, but it's not the thing that is going to create peace or prevent wars when national interests are clashing.
As the political philosophy professor up here, I will also say no. It misses a very important element of the human soul, namely thumos, or spiritedness. The Chinese, as David said, view Taiwan as an existential issue for them, a matter of national honor and pride on a level of importance that it's hard for us to contemplate. If they have to lose a lot of money and break a lot of trading relationships in order to resolve that the way they want, they will do it. They will pay the cost. This is not, at the end of the day, a simple monetary calculation for them, as are many things for all of us, not simple monetary calculations. We're all willing to lose money over matters of honor. The question is just which matter of honor is it motivates you as an individual or as a society.
So one more point on the question we didn't answer over here, which is it's kind of a question about whether America will be thumotic enough or patriotic enough in the case to stand up to China. I think probably the lack of enthusiasm you might see for fighting against China is actually a product of some American realism, which is they may not see Taiwan's fate as being so critical to the safety or prosperity of their children and grandchildren. That's why they may not want to do it, right? If it was coming to Hawaii or Guam or California or other places in the United States, it's a different story. I think Americans will step up to the plate and fight. The problem is that our foreign policy, especially our approach to extended defense and deterrence, is that we have pushed other countries that are relatively tertiary or secondary to our interest to being more primary concerns, and Americans probably aren't going to buy that. I don't want to sacrifice my kids for Ukraine. If my kids had to fight to defend the bridge at Concord, that's a different story. I wouldn't want them to perish, but it would be a noble honor to support your country there. It's not a noble honor to fight for the Azov battalion in Mariupol.
There's one other problem. There is a disconnect, which I see between mainstream American public opinion, which I think is not very enthusiastic for these kinds of things these days, and people in the service. And I don't mean that to criticize people in the service, but they view it, many of them, people I know in the Navy in particular, do think it's a matter of their personal honor, the service's honor, and the United States' honor that it meets its commitments, say, to Taiwan, and they're not ready to back down if either the Chinese precipitate a crisis or if a crisis is somehow precipitated. And then you may see, which is very troubling, contemplate this in advance, a disconnect between a service or parts of our armed services that want it, that want the fight and think that it's right and just and noble, and a population that doesn't. And I don't know what happens then, but that's not really good for the country when we've been in this position before and it hasn't been good for us.
But it is good that we don't have a commitment to defend Taiwan, correct? We do not have a commitment to defend Taiwan, correct?
We have no formal commitment to defend Taiwan.
Yes or no on does trade bring peace between nations or not?
There was a famous book by a guy named Angel about how world trade would prevent war for all time. I think it was published in, 1911, 1912. Became a bestseller. Of course, we had World War I 2 or 3 years later. No, trade does not prevent war. What Michael said is exactly right. Honor is always more important than money.
Great. We will end there. We have 20 minutes until our next keynote by Philip Blond. That's at 4:15, so get a quick coffee. One final announcement as well. Everyone's invited to a reception at 5:30 in the Diplomat Room before dinner, which will be back here at 6:30. So we'll see you all in 20 minutes.